Hello everyone, welcome back to the third video of the Consumer Protection Act under the law of torts. Now, revising the previous two videos, I would like to just give you all a one highlight kind which will give you a tour to the first and the second video at large. So, in the first and second video, we discussed the main importance, then objective, need of the Consumer Protection Act, starting with the history of the Consumer Protection Act. Then we moved further with the three different parts of the Consumer Protection Act, including the definitions, councils, and the redressal agencies. We started with the definitions under which we covered the consumer, who is not a consumer, then complainant, then complaint, etc. etc. Now, in this video, I would like to give you highlights about the other definitions which are left. So friends, let's get started. So the next definition that we will be talking about is about the consumer dispute. As you can see on the screen, the consumer dispute term is defined under section 2 subclause E of the Consumer Protection Act. Now friends, what do you mean by consumer dispute? It can be stated that any person making a complaint with regard to four categories. Okay, now the first is defect in the goods, deficiency in the services, then unfair trade practices or the restrictive trade practices will be, and the person who is making the complaint for the party will be denying, and then the situation which arises would be known in a layman's language as a consumer dispute. So friends, let's get started with the reading of section 2 subclause E of the Act. Now, according to the Act, it is stated that a dispute where the person against whom a complaint in writing has been made, he denies or disputes the allegations which has been allegedly complained about him, then that would make the consumer dispute a legitimate term. Now friends, moving on to the ingredients of the consumer dispute, it would include the next two definitions, which are the unfair trade practices and the restricted trade practices. Now friends, under the Consumer Protection Act, the term unfair trade practices has been defined under section 2 subclause R. Generally speaking, if we look into the aspect, the unfair trade practices encompasses the broad array of the torts, all of which involves the economic injury which are brought on by the deceptive or wrong conduct of the party. Now the legal theories that can be asserted, including the claims such as the trade secret misrepresentation, then palming off, delusion or disparagement, etc., etc., can be termed as the unfair trade practices. Now if we follow the Consumer Protection Act's definition, you can put it in this way, that an unfair trade practices would mean the trade practices for which the purpose of, under the Act, it can be stated that if you are accepting or if you are practicing any trade practice which are illegal for the purpose of the promotion or sale or use of the supply for any goods or rather any services, then that would be termed as the unfair trade practices. Now there are different subsections or different sub characteristics of the term which we will be seeing. Now looking into the first aspect, it would be that the practice of making the false statement. Next, it would be the misrepresentation. Then you can say that if you are falsely representing or rebuilding any compatible or second hand or reconditioned old good as the new one, then friends, that would be termed as the unfair trade practices. Then any misrepresentation with regard to the standard, quality, quantity, size, or rather any misleading advertisement if the manufacturer is allowing and the trader is practicing the same, then also friends, it will be termed as the unfair trade practices. Now this would also include the practices which are there with regard to the price bargaining or the permission which are given by the manufacturer. Then also, if any fraudulent activity or rather any fraudulent means has been accepted by the public or rather by any party, then that would term as the unfair trade practices. Now, the liability which are falling under the unfair trade practices may be jointly or separately also. Now, that would depend. For an example, there was a case of Kanayalal Radheshyam versus Urmila Rani. Now, in this case, the manufacturer of the oil company was held liable for selling the goods which was not of the adequate quality. The person who consumed the product suffered mental, physical and financial losses for which he was given the compensation. But the person selling the same oil was not held responsible under the unfair trade practices. And so the liability under unfair trade practices was only of the manufacturer and not of the seller. The next example of the unfair trade practices is there under the Maruti Suzuki India Limited versus Rajiv Kumar Lumba case. Now friends, what happened in this case, that the purchaser of the car was charged extra for the part which he did not ask for. Now the dealer on his own, he decided to install that part in the car and he charged the purchaser an extra amount. Now the dealer was considered to practicing for the practicing of the unfair trade practices, and so he was asked to return the extra amount which he charged for the unwanted and unasked products. So friends, this would be termed as the unfair trade practices. Now moving on to the next definition, which is restrictive trade practices. Now friends, the restrictive trade practices has been defined under section 2 subclause NN of the Consumer Protection Act. Now, what do you mean by the restrictive trade practices? Now, as we are following this practice, you should bifurcate the whole term, divide the whole term and understand the meaning. The trade practices which are restrictive in nature. Now, friends, what would you mean by the restrictive in nature? Restrictive trade practices under the law would mean a trade practice which tends to bring about the manipulation for the price or for the conditions of the delivery, or to affect the flow of the supply in the market with regard to the goods and the services in a manner as to impose the consumers with the unjustified cost which they are restricted to practice. Now friends, if any person is following this kind of practice, then it would be termed as the restrictive trade practices under the Consumer Protection Act. Now friends, when we are talking about the certain trade practices which are either unfair or restrictive in its nature, we should be having certain questions in our mind as to this act would be applicable to whom, or rather what would it include and who are excluded from the act. So now talking about the exclusions of the applications of such definitions, that brings in my mind one of the cases which is Indian Medical Association versus VP Santhe. Now friends, under this case, the apex court was of the opinion that the medical practitioners, they are not following one single practice which can be made applicable to all the cases. Now if it is so, then the person, if it is treating another person differently, then you can put it in that way that the person is not using the or is not doing the trade practices in the same manner as he should be doing. But in this case, you can say that the medical practitioners, they cannot apply one method or rather one medicine for everybody. So friends, medical practitioners, according to this case, they were excluded from the Consumer Protection Act. But friends, the same is not the case when it comes to the questions on the legal practitioners. Now, in the K. Vishnu versus National Consumer Redressal Agency, it was held that the wide implications of the definition of the services will include the legal practitioners as one of the persons, and so the person or the individual going to the legal practitioners, they can be termed as a consumer, or rather they can go for the complaint to the agency. And so friends, these different applications of the act becomes very important, and to make this terms applicable, it becomes very important to understand the terms. And so friends, this lecture was dedicated for the definition which are there under the Consumer Protection Act. Now friends, when we are talking about the consumer, or rather the complainant, or rather any trade practices which are not satisfied in nature, or if they are applying the restrictive or unfair means to practice, or they are manipulating the trade, then friends, we should be able to understand that what are the rights that we have as a consumer. Now this question would lead to the next topic, which is there as rights as a consumer. Now, there are certain rights which are ascertained under the Act. Now, what are these rights? The rights are the right to the consumer education, the right to the safety, the right to the redressal part. Then comes the right to disclose the informations, the right to have certain choices, the right to make the representation, and the right to have the healthy environment. So now friends, let's discuss these rights in a little bit of the detailed manner. Now, as you can see on the screen, the rights as a consumer, the first right has been given as the consumer education. The consumers must be able to acquire the knowledge and the skills to make informed and confident choices about the goods and the services that they want to avail. Now, while being aware of the basic consumer rights and responsibilities and how to act on them. Now, this would include, and this is the application of the rights as a consumer, that if they have the right for the consumer education, they should be able to make the independent choices, confident choices of I want to go for this good, or rather I want to render this services. And if a person is able to do the same thing, then that person has availed the right as a consumer. The next right is the right to the safety. Now, from a trade and industry perspective, the consumer should be protected against the product, the process, any services which are dangerous to their health or other life. If the same is kept in mind, then the right to safety is protected. The next right of the consumer is the right to redress. Consumer must receive a fair settlement or just claims, including the compensation for misrepresentation or any shabby goods or services or any trade practices which has availed or which has led them to go through the different harassment of the mental harassment or physical harassment or financial harassment. Then if the person has gone or can stand in the court with regard to the same thing, then that person will stand to have the right of the redressal. Now friends, the next right is the right to the disclosed and the informations. That means if I as a consumer am going to purchase certain goods or render certain services, now it becomes very important that if I have asked for certain factual situations of the goods or services, then the person who is providing me with the same should disclose the informations, all the related informations with regard to the same thing, so that the further complications of non-compliance or rather my rights being violated can be avoided. So the next right of the consumer is right to have the choice. Now, consumers should be able to choose from a range of the product and the services which are offered to them. So that means that competition, existence of the competition in the market becomes very important and vital. If as a consumer, I do not have different choices to be made in the market. For an example, what if I only have one product available in the market from one company? Then I will not be able to compare the same product with any other product. That would violate my right to have a choice as a consumer. So friends, it becomes very important as a consumer to have the right to choose. So for that, the proper competition in the market should be maintained. Moving on to the next right, which is the right to representation. Now, consumers' interests should be represented in the making and the execution of the government policies and the development of the products and the services. So, if the same is protected and followed in the rightful and legal way, then the right of the representation is protected as a consumer. The next and the last right, which are stated, can be termed as the right to have a healthy environment. Now we talked about the hazardous goods and the activities or services. Now friends, if as a consumer we should be able to live or rather work in an environment that is not threatening to the well-being of an individual or for the future generations also. So if we as an individual are having, or rather we as a consumer are having that kind of right, we can state that we do have the right for the healthy environment. Now friends, if these rights are protected, we can definitely have the locus standi to stand in the court. Now friends, what do you mean by locus standi? Locus standi means who can stand in the court. The person whose rights are violated will have the ability, or rather he will be able to stand in the court. So friends, that means if these rights are violated, a person termed as a consumer or rather complainant will have the right to stand in the court, and that means the person will have the right to represent his case and the right to have the compensation if the case has been proven so. And so it becomes very important for any individual to understand that when would I have these rights. So friends, these were the definitions, or rather important terms under the Consumer Protection Act. Now friends, in the next video we will be looking at the Consumer Protection Councils and the redressal agencies along with the amendments. Now so friends, till then, take care. Bye bye.